What if I told you that in the quiet farmlands of Nebraska, a man's forehead began growing so rapidly that doctors couldn't explain it, and when it finally cracked open, what they found inside changed everything we thought we knew about human anatomy? This isn't science fiction. This is the terrifying true story of Thomas McKenzie, a 45-year-old corn farmer whose life became a nightmare that would haunt an entire community for decades. But before we reveal the shocking truth about what was growing inside Thomas's skull, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you're completely alone? Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why the residents of Millfield County still refuse to walk past the old McKenzie farm after sunset. The morning of March 15, 2019, started like any other for Thomas McKenzie. He woke before dawn in his modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Millfield, Nebraska, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business. Thomas had inherited the 300-acre farm from his father, just as his father had inherited it from his grandfather. 3 generations of McKenzies had worked this land, growing corn and soybeans that fed families across the Midwest. Thomas was a simple man who believed in hard work, honest living, and the cycles of nature that governed his crops and his life. That particular morning, Thomas noticed something odd while shaving. His forehead seemed slightly more prominent than usual. He rubbed his fingers across the area just above his eyebrows and felt a subtle swelling. It wasn't painful, just unusual. Thomas figured he might have bumped his head while working in the barn the previous day. Farm work was dangerous, and minor injuries were part of the job. He thought nothing more of it and went about his morning routine. Sarah McKenzie, Thomas's wife of 22 years, was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She was a nurse at the local clinic and had developed a keen eye for medical abnormalities. When Thomas sat down for his coffee and eggs, she immediately noticed the slight protrusion on his forehead. "Honey, what happened to your head?" Sarah asked, reaching across the small kitchen table to examine the swelling. Thomas touched the area gently. "Must have knocked it yesterday. You know how low that beam is in the old barn?" Sarah nodded, but something about the swelling bothered her. In her 15 years of nursing, she had seen countless bumps and bruises, but this looked different. The skin wasn't discolored, and Thomas showed no signs of pain when she pressed gently on the area. It was as if the bone itself was simply larger than it had been the day before. Over the next week, the swelling became more pronounced. Thomas found himself avoiding mirrors and pulling his baseball cap low over his eyes when he went into town for supplies. The growth wasn't painful, but it was impossible to ignore. Sarah measured the protrusion with a ruler and was alarmed to discover it had grown nearly an inch in just 7 days. "Thomas, this isn't normal," she said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the cornfields golden. "I think you need to see Dr. Harrison." Dr. William Harrison had been Millfield's only physician for over 30 years. He had delivered half the babies in town and had seen just about every medical condition imaginable in rural Nebraska. When Thomas reluctantly made an appointment, Dr. Harrison was initially puzzled by the unusual growth. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Harrison admitted as he examined Thomas's forehead with a magnifying glass. "It's not a typical hematoma or abscess. The skin looks healthy, and there's no sign of infection. I'm going to order some x-rays and blood work." The x-rays revealed something that made Dr. Harrison's hands tremble as he held them up to the light. Thomas's frontal bone was not only enlarged but appeared to have a peculiar honeycomb-like structure that extended deep into his skull. The blood work showed elevated levels of certain proteins that Dr. Harrison couldn't identify. "I need to refer you to a specialist in Omaha," Dr. Harrison told Thomas. "This is beyond my expertise." But Thomas was a stubborn man who distrusted big city doctors and expensive medical procedures. He had crops to plant and fields to tend. Spring was the busiest time of year for a farmer, and he couldn't afford to waste time traveling to Omaha for tests that would probably tell him nothing was seriously wrong. "I feel fine, Doc," Thomas insisted. "Just a little swelling. It'll go down on its own." Dr. Harrison tried to persuade him, but Thomas left the clinic with a prescription for pain medication he didn't need and a promise to return if the condition worsened. Sarah was furious when Thomas told her about his decision to skip the specialist appointment. "You're being ridiculous," she said, pacing around their living room. What if it's a tumor? What if it's something serious? Thomas pulled her close and kissed her forehead. Sarah, I've been farming this land for 25 years. I know my body, and I know when something's worth worrying about. This isn't. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that Thomas's condition was far from normal. The growth on his forehead continued to expand at an alarming rate. By the end of April, it had grown to the size of a tennis ball, creating a grotesque bulge that made Thomas look like something from a medical textbook. He stopped going to church, stopped visiting the local diner for coffee with his friends, and spent his days working alone in the fields, hiding under wide-brimmed hats and avoiding human contact. The physical changes were accompanied by other strange symptoms. Thomas began experiencing vivid dreams that seemed more real than his waking life. In these dreams, he found himself in vast underground caverns filled with a soft, pulsing light. He could hear voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The voices told him about ancient secrets buried deep beneath the Nebraska soil, about civilizations that had existed long before humans walked the earth. Sarah noticed that her husband was changing in other ways too. His eyes, once a warm brown, had developed flecks of an unusual greenish color. His skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and sometimes, late at night, she could swear she saw a faint glow emanating from the growth on his forehead. "Thomas, you're scaring me," Sarah said one night in early May as she watched him staring out their bedroom window at the dark fields. "Please, let me drive you to Omaha tomorrow. We need answers." Thomas turned to look at her, and for a moment, Sarah didn't recognize the man she had married. His eyes held an intensity she had never seen before, and when he smiled, it seemed forced and unnatural. "There's nothing to be afraid of," he said in a voice that sounded like his own but somehow different. "I'm learning things, Sarah. Important things about our land, about what lies beneath it." The next morning, Thomas was gone before dawn. Sarah found a note on the kitchen table written in handwriting that looked like her husband's but was somehow more precise, more controlled than his usual scrawl. The note simply said, "Gone to check the north field. Back by evening." But Thomas didn't return that evening or the next. Sarah called the sheriff, and a search party was organized to scour the Mackenzie property. They found Thomas 3 days later in the center of the north field, standing motionless among the young corn plants, staring up at the sky. He was alive but unresponsive, and the growth on his forehead had doubled in size. Dr. Harrison was called to the scene, and he immediately ordered Thomas to be transported to the medical center in Omaha. The growth was now so large that it obscured Thomas's eyes and stretched the skin of his scalp to a dangerous thinness. X-rays revealed that the strange honeycomb structure had expanded throughout his skull, and brain scans showed activity in regions that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a neurologist at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, had never encountered anything like Thomas's condition in her 20-year career. The growth appeared to be organic brain tissue, but it exhibited properties unlike anything in medical literature. It seemed to be actively generating its own neural pathways and connecting to parts of Thomas's brain in ways that defied explanation. "We need to operate," Dr. Chun told Sarah during a consultation. "The pressure on his brain is increasing, and if we don't act soon, he could suffer permanent damage or death." Sarah signed the consent forms with shaking hands, praying that the surgery would restore her husband to the man he had been just months before. The operation was scheduled for the following morning. On the night before the surgery, Thomas experienced a moment of clarity. He opened his eyes and looked at Sarah with recognition for the first time in weeks. His voice was weak but coherent when he spoke. "Sarah, I need to tell you something important," he whispered. "What's happening to me isn't natural. There's something under our land, something that's been there for thousands of years. It's trying to communicate, and I'm the conduit." Sarah squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Just focus on getting better, honey. After the surgery, everything will be back to normal." Thomas shook his head weakly. "No, you need to understand. The dreams I've been having, they're not dreams. I've been visiting a place deep underground, a city built by beings that lived here long before humans existed. They're trying to share their knowledge with me, but my body can't handle the process. Before Sarah could respond, Thomas lost consciousness again, and his vital signs returned to the strange, elevated patterns that had puzzled doctors for weeks. The surgery began at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late May. Dr. Chan and her team had prepared for a complex procedure, but nothing could have prepared them for what they discovered when they opened Thomas's skull. The growth wasn't a tumor or an abscess. It was a perfectly formed organ unlike anything in human biology. It had its own blood supply, its own neural network, and it was actively producing electrical impulses that defied medical understanding. As Dr. Chun began to examine the organ more closely, something extraordinary happened. The moment her instruments made contact with the tissue, she was overwhelmed by a flood of images and sensations. She saw vast underground chambers carved from living rock, filled with beings of incredible beauty and intelligence. She experienced memories that weren't her own, knowledge of sciences and technologies that were beyond human comprehension. The experience lasted only seconds, but when Dr. Chun regained her composure, she realized that the organ wasn't just growing inside Thomas's skull. It was communicating with him. It was a biological interface, a bridge between human consciousness and something far more ancient and advanced. Dr. Chun made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Instead of removing the organ, she carefully closed Thomas's skull and terminated the surgery. She told the surgical team that the growth was inoperable due to its integration with critical brain structures, but the truth was far more complex. That night, Dr. Chun returned to Thomas's room alone. She found him awake and alert, his eyes now completely transformed to a brilliant green color that seemed to glow in the dim hospital lighting. "You saw them, didn't you?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying an otherworldly quality. "In the underground city." Dr. Chun nodded, unable to speak. The experience during the surgery had changed her in ways she couldn't yet understand. She felt as though she had been given a glimpse of something profound and terrible, a truth about the world that she wasn't sure humanity was ready to know. "They've been waiting," Thomas continued, "waiting for someone who could serve as a bridge between their world and ours. They chose me because I work the land, because I understand the deep connections between all living things." Over the following days, Thomas's condition stabilized, but he was no longer entirely human. The organ in his skull continued to grow, but it had reached a state of equilibrium with his biology. He could access memories and knowledge from the underground civilization at will, and he claimed to be in constant communication with beings he called the Ancient Ones. Dr. Chun became obsessed with Thomas's case, conducting unauthorized tests and documenting everything she could about his transformation. She discovered that the organic material comprising the new organ wasn't entirely biological. It contained trace elements that didn't exist naturally on Earth, suggesting an extraterrestrial or interdimensional origin. News of Thomas's condition began to leak from the medical center, despite Dr. Chen's efforts to maintain secrecy. Tabloid reporters, conspiracy theorists, and government agents all became interested in the farmer from Nebraska, whose brain was apparently communicating with an ancient alien civilization. Sarah found herself at the center of a media circus she never wanted. Reporters camped outside her house, and strange men in dark suits asked questions about her husband's property and the family's history on the land. She began to research the history of their farm and made a disturbing discovery. According to county records, the Mackenzie family hadn't been the first to own their land. In the 1800s, the property had been owned by a man named Ezra Blackwood, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Local Native American tribes had legends about the area, stories of a sacred place where the spirits of the deep earth could communicate with the living world. Most disturbing of all, Sarah discovered that Ezra Blackwood had been found 3 days before his disappearance with a strange growth on his forehead, standing motionless in the center of what was now the Mackenzie's North Field. Sarah drove to the medical center in Omaha to confront Thomas with this information, but when she arrived, she found his hospital room empty. The nursing staff claimed he had been discharged, but there was no record of his release and no one could explain where he had gone. Dr. Chun was also missing, and hospital security footage showed both of them leaving together in the early hours of the morning, walking with purpose toward the parking garage. The surveillance cameras captured something else that would never be officially reported. Thomas's forehead was glowing with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to respond to some invisible signal. Sarah drove home to find Thomas waiting for her in their kitchen, sitting at the same table where they had shared breakfast countless times over the years. But the man before her was only partly the husband she had loved. The growth on his forehead had cracked open, revealing a crystalline structure that pulsed with internal light. Through the opening, Sarah could see what looked like a miniature galaxy of stars and swirling energy. "I know you're frightened," Thomas said, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from somewhere beyond normal space. "But I need you to understand that this is a gift, not a curse. The Ancient Ones have chosen our family, our land, to be the guardians of knowledge that could transform humanity." Sarah backed toward the door, her nurse's training warring with her love for her husband. The rational part of her mind recognized that Thomas was no longer entirely human, but her heart saw the man she had married, the gentle farmer who had never hurt anyone in his life. "What do they want?" she whispered. Thomas smiled, and for a moment, Sarah saw a glimpse of her old husband beneath the alien transformation. "They want to share their gifts with humanity, but slowly, carefully. Our species isn't ready for their full knowledge yet. They need intermediaries, people who can help bridge the gap between worlds." Dr. Chun appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Sarah gasped at her appearance. The neurologist's eyes had the same green glow as Thomas's, and there was a small growth beginning to form on her own forehead. "It's not contagious in the traditional sense," Dr. Chun explained, apparently reading Sarah's thoughts. "The transformation only occurs in those who are chosen, those who have a genetic predisposition and a spiritual openness to communication with higher forms of consciousness." Over the following weeks, Sarah watched as more people in Millfield began to exhibit similar symptoms. The town's librarian, Martha Hendricks, developed a small growth after spending time cataloging old books about local history. The elementary school principal, Robert Hayes, began experiencing vivid dreams after visiting the Mackenzie farm to check on Thomas's welfare. The government tried to intervene, sending teams of scientists and military personnel to investigate the anomalies in Millfield. But the Ancient Ones had learned from centuries of human contact that direct intervention was counterproductive. Instead, they worked through their chosen intermediaries to gradually introduce their knowledge to humanity. Thomas became the unofficial leader of what the townspeople began calling the Awakened. These individuals maintained their human personalities and relationships, but they also served as conduits for information and wisdom from the underground civilization. They taught advanced agricultural techniques that increased crop yields without damaging the environment. They shared medical knowledge that helped Dr. Harrison treat previously incurable conditions. They provided insights into sustainable energy sources that could power entire cities without pollution. Sarah struggled with her decision for months. The growth in Thomas's forehead had stabilized, and the opening provided a window into a universe of knowledge and beauty that was both terrifying and wonderful. She could see that her husband was happier than he had ever been, connected to something greater than himself while still maintaining his love for her and his commitment to their life together. The choice came to her in a dream one night in the autumn after Thomas's transformation. She found herself standing in the underground city she had heard Thomas describe, surrounded by beings of light and wisdom who communicated through pure thought and emotion. They showed her visions of Earth's future, both the potential destruction that awaited humanity if it continued on its current path, and the incredible prosperity and peace that could be achieved if the Ancient One's knowledge was accepted and integrated. When Sarah woke, she felt a familiar tingling sensation on her forehead. Looking in the mirror, she saw a small growth beginning to form, barely visible but definitely present. Instead of fear, she felt relief. She finally understood that Thomas's transformation wasn't a medical condition or an alien invasion. It was an evolution, a next step in humanity's development that would allow the species to survive and thrive in ways previously unimaginable. The story of Thomas Mackenzie and the town of Millfield never made it into mainstream medical journals or news reports. Government agencies classified the information and relocated the affected residents to a secure facility where they could be studied and monitored. Official records state that a chemical spill from an agricultural research facility caused temporary neurological symptoms in several local residents, who were successfully treated and returned to normal lives. But in certain circles, among researchers who study unexplained phenomena and investigators who look into government cover-ups. The story of the farmer whose forehead cracked open to reveal a window into another world has become legend. They say that if you drive through the cornfields of central Nebraska on certain nights, you can still see lights glowing beneath the ground, and sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind through the grain, you can hear voices speaking in languages older than human civilization. Dr. Chen's research notes, hidden in a safety deposit box in Omaha, tell a different story than the official reports. According to her observations, the Ancient Ones weren't aliens or interdimensional beings at all. They were the original inhabitants of Earth, a species that had evolved beyond physical form millions of years ago and had been waiting patiently for humanity to develop enough to join them in a higher state of existence. The growth on Thomas's forehead wasn't a tumor or a parasite, it was a chrysalis, a biological mechanism that allowed human consciousness to interface with the collective knowledge of the Ancient Ones. The process was irreversible, but it wasn't harmful. Those who underwent the transformation gained access to wisdom and abilities that made them more than human while allowing them to retain their individual identities and personal relationships. Sarah's journal, found years later when the abandoned Mackenzie farmhouse was finally demolished, reveals that the couple lived happily together for several more years after the transformation. Thomas continued to farm the land, but his crops grew with unprecedented vigor and nutritional value. Sarah used her enhanced medical knowledge to help people throughout the region, performing what seemed like miraculous healings using techniques that combined ancient wisdom with cutting-edge biotechnology. According to Sarah's final entry, dated just before they voluntarily entered the government facility, she and Thomas made the decision to cooperate with the authorities not because they were forced to, but because they understood that humanity needed time to prepare for the full revelation of the Ancient One's presence. The transformation would continue, but gradually over generations until enough humans had evolved to create a stable bridge between the two species. The truth about what really happened in Millfield remains classified, but investigators have noted similar incidents occurring in isolated communities around the world. Farmers in rural Montana reporting strange dreams and unusual growths. Fishermen in coastal Maine discovering crystalline formations in their heads that allowed them to communicate with sea life. Indigenous communities in Alaska developing enhanced sensory abilities after exposure to artifacts buried in the permafrost. Each case follows the same pattern: initial fear and confusion, followed by gradual acceptance and enhancement of human capabilities. The affected individuals never report feeling harmed or controlled by their transformations. Instead, they describe a sense of coming home, of finally understanding their true place in a universe far larger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined. The Mackenzie farm remains abandoned, surrounded by government barriers and warning signs about chemical contamination. But satellite imagery shows that the cornfields continue to grow wild and vibrant, creating geometric patterns that seem to pulse with their own internal rhythm. And sometimes, on clear nights when atmospheric conditions are just right, pilots flying over central Nebraska report seeing a soft glow emanating from beneath the ground, as if the earth itself is dreaming of things to come.